Hello, this is Tom Perriello. Welcome to our Facebook Live Townhall for the day. For those of you who've enjoyed a snow day in Northern Virginia or elsewhere, congratulations. Hopefully you've had some good time outside. We were sad not to be able to make it down to Williamsburg for the Town Hall, so we thought we would just make it available to everyone who was able to tune in live today. So for those who don't know, I'm running for governor here in Virginia, and we are so incredibly touched by the grassroots outpouring over the last 10 weeks to get this campaign off of the ground. I want to take your questions from Facebook and Twitter and other platforms today to talk about what we can do here in Virginia to make sure that everyone gets a fair shot. This has been the land of opportunity for me and my family. My father was able to get a scholarship to go to the University of Virginia, and that was his ticket into the middle class and the American dream. And we want to just make sure that's an opportunity that's available to all Virginians, regardless of what color they are, what region they're from. And in order to do that, we need to invest in strong public education. We need to make sure that higher education is affordable, including at least 2 years of debt-free community college or apprenticeship programs, and that everyone is treated with dignity under the law through a criminal justice system that is finally updated from some of our repressive past. We're excited to get to work here, so I will jump in with some of the questions that have been posted so far. Robin Weeks wrote in and said, "Thank you. Please tell me what you plan to do about the Health Care Act. Thanks." For those who don't know, when I was in Congress, I had the opportunity to vote for the Affordable Care Act. Many people said that it would cost me my congressional seat, but I felt like it was important to do the right thing. And we've seen over 400,000 Virginians get their health care, including me, on the Obamacare exchanges in the state. But there are over 3 million Virginians who've also benefited from getting rid of the lifetime and annual caps, who've gotten the guarantees of universal contraception and pre- and postnatal care, and the closing of the prescription drug donut holes. All of that is under threat with the Repeal Act being offered in Congress. I will guarantee that in Virginia we will do everything we can during this campaign to try to make sure the Affordable Care Act is not repealed and to make sure that Virginians continue to have options on the state exchange. What I do want to say to people, though, across the state is that the resistance is working. The protests, the town hall meetings, even where representatives haven't shown up, has been incredible. People coming up and telling the stories of how the Affordable Care Act has helped their family. Not just that people are saving about $3,500 per year on premiums relative to where projections had been, but also where it's been a life-saving issue of access. So I believe those stories have gotten through and have made many members of Congress, even Republicans, hesitant to pull back on this act. So first thing we're going to do is continue to support those stories and that organizing around the state to make sure that we don't move backwards to the days that people could be denied insurance for pre-existing conditions. Zach Russell writes in, "Dear Mr. Perriello, I have lost some hearing and expect to lose more in the coming years due to a disease. Because of this, I've learned sign language and recently had to buy hearing aids. I was thankful they were only $2,500. They're normally twice that. Having interacted with many deaf over the years and losing hearing myself, I'm very concerned with deaf rights and awareness, as well as the exorbitant cost of hearing aids. I have traditionally voted Republican, primarily because I am strongly pro-life, but I am beginning to reconsider some of the other positions Republicans stand for, particularly minimum wage and health care. For these reasons, I'm considering voting for you. Where do you stand on deaf issues? Also, if you could completely rebuild the healthcare system, what would you do about the cost of hearing aids? I know you would only be effective in Virginia and only with the state legislature cooperating, but if you had optimum cooperation." Well, Zach, thank you very much for telling your story on that issue. We had the opportunity last month to meet with leading representatives of the deaf community from across Virginia during a meeting we had organized in the Harrisonburg area. And it was an extremely useful opportunity for me to hear about the everyday experiences that our neighbors have to go through who are deaf. Not just the issues of education in a classroom, but also what I found most harrowing was the issue of how going to doctors and clinics that may not have access to people who know how to sign can create at our most traumatic moments an increased stress. There's work being done to be able to use virtual signing and other means, but ultimately people want to make sure that there's access in those emergency situations to someone who can communicate. In the Affordable Care Act, we actually tried to begin addressing some of the equipment issues, including hearing aids within some of the deductibilities and caps, and we want to make sure that we continue to have multiple options for people in the deaf community, whether that's a mainstreaming education opportunity or one that's within a traditional community. So I've continued to learn a great deal from the deaf community, and we would very much like to ensure that affordability is a key part of that. And I think this comes back to what we need to look at with the healthcare system as a whole. I believe that we need to get rid of the antitrust protections provided to health insurance companies. That was a bill I sponsored in Congress that was able to have bipartisan support, and that we would create a competitive market in which everybody has access to affordable care. In Virginia, we are hoping first and foremost that we will not see the steps backwards if the Affordable Care Act is pulled back, and we will continue to fight for the Medicaid expansion that would have brought over $8 billion of federal investment into our most vulnerable neighbors. But it doesn't just help those who are struggling as the working poor. It also helps those in the middle class paying private premiums because fewer deadweight costs are passed along. Sherry Wright Jeter, please continue to oppose pipelines. How will you improve and support green energy and environmental protections? For those who don't know, we have come out in opposition to two proposed natural gas pipelines that cross the Commonwealth of Virginia. We believe that these would cost $6.7 billion, even though the federal government has said the utilities have not proven that there's a need for them even to exist. We do want to put people to work, building and growing things here in Virginia, particularly our brothers and sisters in the trades and the construction industry, where we need to see job growth. But we believe we can create more jobs at a fraction of the cost by investing in energy efficiency, weatherization, and clean and renewable energy. And we've already seen this happen in North Carolina. In North Carolina, even under a very conservative governor, he was unable to move backwards on the renewable energy standards because they had created too many jobs and too many businesses in too many red parts of the state. We don't want to see Virginia continue to be 48th out of 50th just because of the power our utilities have over our legislature. I've not only opposed the pipelines, but I've made clear that I will refuse to accept any money from publicly regulated monopolies here in Virginia. We think there's huge job creation potential, including in some of the most economically hard-hit parts of the state. So we are making it an absolute priority to focus on clean energy jobs. Weatherization is something that can help struggling families pay less on their energy bill, because the cheapest energy is the energy you never pay for because you aren't using it in the first place. This is also something that can help, particularly with creating small businesses. One of the things is that we try to focus on is that 2/3 of new job creation comes from small businesses. And often it's the bigger businesses that have the compliance departments and other things to be able to rig the system and not pay their taxes or their fair share. Heather Davis says, how will you work to end gerrymandering? This is a huge priority for us on the campaign. The next governor of Virginia will have the power to veto any district maps that come to the desk that would rig the system in the direction of one party or another. I have made absolutely clear that I will veto any partisan map, whether it comes from Democrats, Republicans, or both of them together. We do not need a bipartisan rigged system. We need a nonpartisan fair system in order to make sure that the voters of Virginia are picking their politicians instead of the politicians being able to carve out and pick their voters. But I think it's not enough to just say that I will veto the bill. That's the easy part for a politician. What I will do is commit to 2 years of barnstorming around the state, making the case for this, and making it impossible for elected officials to be able to come home to their constituents and explain why it is that they support rigging the system. We've already seen tremendous leadership from One Virginia 2021 and other groups to demand nonpartisan redistricting, and I believe that their brave leadership has already shown that we can change the politics of this issue. The system's been rigged for too long. It stood in the way of very simple, pragmatic reforms like raising the minimum wage, ensuring paid medical leave, adding universal pre-K, things that have strong support both from liberal and conservative people across Virginia who just want to see families have a fair shot. So we're going to make sure that we can get rid of the gerrymandered district maps after the coming census. All right. Francois Stovall says, there's so much money in politics, 2 exclamation points, I agree, and so much of it comes from the richest 0.01% or lobbyists or corporations. How do you plan to bring balance to money in politics so regular folks have a voice? Francois, you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, I saw this in Congress, and I'm seeing it even more when we look at the legislature in Richmond, because in Virginia, we actually have unlimited corporate contributions and coordination options for candidates. Without a whole lot of sunshine and attention on it, this is something that allows the richest and most powerful to exert way too much influence over the process. I think it tends to mean that those at the top tend to have a lot more influence than those who are trying to make it out from the bottom. Again, we see very common sense issues like raising the minimum wage that passed even in a red state like West Virginia, but we haven't been able to see that progress because of a rigged map and a rigged contribution process. I find this very depressing when I was in Congress, and I've told this story before, that I was very proud to go to leadership and say that I wanted to be on the Veterans Affairs Committee. It was one of the great honors of my life to get to serve on the Veterans Affairs Committee. I'd spent time in Afghanistan and Sudan and other conflict zones and had a chance to work very closely with our men and women in uniform. I'd seen so many of them coming back, dealing with post-traumatic stress and other challenges, and really wanted to serve on the committee. But I figured it would be extremely difficult to get a seat as a freshman because everyone would want to be serving their veterans. But when I went to leadership and asked whether I could get on, they said, sure. I said, why? And one of them confided in me, well, you can't raise money off of the Veterans Affairs Committee, so it's not where people go to spend their time. Way too many of our politicians are focused on prioritizing what gets them to the next election cycle and what gets them the biggest campaign checks. This is a broken system, and we have to fix it in Virginia. Faisal Rahman said, over the past years, Muslim Americans have been demonized to the point where we have to prove that we are not terrorists. Many hardworking, tax-paying Muslims are scared about their future. How would you address this issue if elected as the governor of Virginia? Well, thank you so much for your question. We are so proud that Virginia has become a much more diverse state, including ethnic and immigrant communities from around the world and from every religion. And it has been terrible to see the kind of politics of hate and division and bigotry that has been promoted by President Trump and by too many politicians before him as well. This was the most racially divisive campaign of my lifetime. But I'm very proud of the fact that nearly 60% of Virginians who went to the polls in November rejected that politics of hate and division. President Trump did worse in Virginia than any Republican in my lifetime. And I think that reminds us that Virginia is a beloved community. We are an inclusive commonwealth, and we do see our diversity as an enormous strength. When I launched my campaign on January 5th, I guaranteed that we would be a firewall against that politics of hate here in Virginia, that we would make sure that we remained an inclusive community, and that as governor I would stand with vulnerable communities against unconstitutional and unconscionable attacks. This is work I had done previously in the nonprofit world, building interfaith coalitions to promote justice, addressing climate change and poverty, and bringing communities together. I helped run an organization called Center for American Progress Action that had done a definitive report on Islamophobia and then Fear, Inc., tracking some of the funding networks that promoted anti-Muslim bigotry across the country. This is an important fight for all of us to be a part of, and I appreciate you raising it today. All right. Laura Foe. Since the election, there's been a lot of talk about reshaping the Democratic Party. Can you please share what you think the vision of the Democratic Party should be? Thanks. I think that the Democratic Party right now should be bold. It should stand for its core principles of ensuring the dignity and rights of all citizens, regardless of color, religion, ethnicity. We must be willing to stand up for those who are being bullied by President Trump and beyond. But we also want to have a positive vision for everybody of inclusive economic growth. I think it's important for the Democratic Party and all leaders to understand that there have been some very deep changes in our economy in recent years. It used to be that when the GDP grew, most people gained with it. But we've begun to see a disconnect between macroeconomic growth and whether jobs are being created and whether the middle class is getting a piece of that. we need to make sure that our economic growth is something that brings all people along with it. So I think it's important that we stand for inclusive economic growth. We also need to stand firmly for breaking the school-to-prison pipeline that is allowing too many of our young people who have great potential to end up in a criminal justice system. Virginia, for all of its progress, has one of the most regressive criminal codes in the country. It's actually a state where even stealing a cell phone constitutes felony larceny. It's one of the lowest rates in the entire country. And the amount of indigent legal defense that we provide is extremely low. We want to be figuring out how to create a school-to-workforce pipeline instead of a school-to-prison pipeline. And that has to mean investing not just in education, but in multiple pathways into the workforce. We've tried to promote apprenticeship programs and career and technical training along with community college and four-year universities. We see offering 2 years of skill training or community college debt-free not as a new entitlement program or wasteful expenditure. It's an investment in people. For 30 years, we've tried a trickle-down approach that says if we give enough breaks to the people at the top, it will come trickle down to the rest of us, and it has not worked. But we can have trickle-up economics, where when we invest in people, particularly our young people, we will see that grow across the economy and all of us be better for it. As governor, I'm going to be doing a combination of defense and offense. It's going to be extremely important for me to be in a position to veto some of the terrible legislation that regularly comes out of our legislative body, including attacks on a woman's right to choose, including terrible gun laws where we need common sense gun reform to keep our communities safe, and making sure that Virginia doesn't see the kind of attacks on public education that we saw in North Carolina. But we also want to focus on a positive vision here that gets back to ensuring that everybody has that shot at the American dream here in Virginia. If you have a question, be sure to post it in the comments below. I'm being told to remind folks, so let me keep going. Megan Rachel, or Rochelle, says, hey, I'm from the Southwest Virginia, Wise County to be exact. Our area struggles economically and there's a lot of poverty, especially since coal mining has went the way of the dinosaur. How will you help us down here in the heart of Appalachia? Thank you, Megan, for the question. As you may know, I was down through southwestern Virginia for several days earlier this month and really appreciated getting to sit down with coal miners, both those active and retired. We also spent a good part of a day with our first responders who are working on the opioid crisis that has been such a disaster for that area. We know that there are 3 Virginians who die every day from the opioid crisis. And I talked to a mom who's also a counselor at the clinic who was saying that her son, who's in the 6th grade, has already seen 14 of his classmates lose a parent to the opioid crisis this year. It's important for us to make sure we hold accountable those who helped create the crisis, including those in big pharma industry. But most of all, we need to focus on saving lives. We could do that with treating addiction as a public health crisis, not a criminal crisis, and work on trying to encourage people to move in to seek help. When I met with counselors, they had many recommendations of things we could do to address the crisis. But the number one they said was we need to destigmatize going to seek treatment. It needs to be seen as an act of courage, not an act of giving up. And we certainly want to make sure that that's crucial, that's a message we pass to everybody across that region. But we also want to continue to see southwestern Virginia as a huge opportunity. We met with coal miners and others there, and we're talking about how we can continue to make this a destination with artisanal production of food, of beverages, of quilts, of bluegrass. It's an incredibly vibrant place, and I think there are great opportunities that could help to encourage more young people to stay in the community. We talked about the importance of supporting apprenticeship programs and the trades. This is an area where we should be growing our own energy, the future energy that's clean. We believe we can do that in southwestern Virginia if we invest in the kind of infrastructure we need and create the incentives for weatherization and taking wind and solar to scale. So it's important for us to continue showing up and listening to those in the community, where sometimes we've seen public schools where the roofs are literally falling in. And I think it's important to remember that this is an area that has been an engine of the Virginia economy, just like Southside Virginia, and that if we invest and believe that economic development can grow there again, that people will rise to that challenge. All right. Margaret Feitner. I want to know what you're going to do to ensure that women have access to the health care that they need. State governments need to stay out of the medical procedures agreed to between a woman and her doctor. Margaret, I absolutely agree. It's essential that we not only protect a woman's right to choose, but we ensure the affordability and access of those decisions that are being left between a woman and her doctor. I was proud to support the Affordable Care Act, which included universal coverage for contraception and guaranteed coverage of pre- and postnatal care. As you know, being a woman was effectively a pre-existing condition where women paid much higher premiums in the healthcare market. We needed to make sure that access to all health care for women is affordable and equal. But in Virginia, we've seen particular attacks on a woman's right to choose and on access to exercising that right to choose. We will fight hard in Virginia to remain a brick wall between a regressive legislature and that woman's right to choose. We saw some trap laws come into place, trap laws that I helped to fight in my advocacy days after Congress. And we will continue to ensure that veto protection that Governor McAuliffe has been able to provide for the last few years. Noah Goodwin, if you are elected, will you stand with LGBTQ plus Virginians and pledge to veto any legislation that denies us fair and equal pay, housing, health care, or is blatantly discriminatory? Thanks, Noah. I absolutely will. I was an advocate for the LGBT community in Congress, but also in my nonprofit advocacy days. We've tried to make sure when President Trump recently withdrew the progress made under President Obama protecting our trans teens, that we not only condemned the act, but we asked to meet with a set of parents of trans teens from around the state. I was really touched when about a dozen of them came together to tell their stories and talk again about what it means for those who are in power to be using that power to protect the vulnerable instead of to beat up and bully the vulnerable. Or 50% of trans teens consider some form of self-harm or suicide. When these sorts of messages are sent from President Trump down, they have immediate effects on some of our most vulnerable teenagers. So I will stand with them and stand with the vulnerable, whether it's issues of bathrooms or basic rights or equal protections in the private sector. So we thank you for your question, and we will certainly continue to block those pieces of legislation that deny equality in Virginia. Catherine Laughlin, what do you propose to do to address restoring voting rights to felons? First of all, I really want to give a shout out to Governor McAuliffe, who's done a great job of leading on the effort to restore voting rights to those who've had them taken away under our system. We continue to have one of the most regressive laws on the books in terms of denying voting rights, as well as a terrible tradition across generations of voter suppression. So we will continue those efforts. But I want us to think more boldly than that. In Virginia, we're the birthplace of American democracy. And I believe that Virginia should be the first state in the country to be able to reach 100% voter participation. I think we should be challenging our technology community and others to say, how can we ensure that every single citizen participates in our elections? We're a healthier and more representative democracy when everybody feels some ownership over the process. So we will continue to make sure rights are restored, but also do everything we can for every citizen, including those who may be working multiple jobs or trying to get kids to multiple soccer practices, to say, hey, should we still really be voting exactly the same way that we did centuries ago in terms of needing to go on one day to one physical location? Let's be a center of innovation in how we can ensure greater democratic participation. All right. Maggie Rosberg. Hi, Tom Perriello. Hey. As a fourth year at UVA, congratulations, how will you help students with debt? Thanks, Maggie. Virginia students are often leaving college with an average of $30,000 in student debt. We also have some of the highest average rates of credit card debt in the country. Here we have young people who are doing everything that we encourage them to do. Work hard, play by the rules, get yourself into a good college, study, and enter the workforce. But instead of that being something we reward, it's something that we burden with an enormous amount of debt. And during those initial years where it used to be you'd be saving up for the first down payment on a house, you're spending those years paying down the student debt, and you're renting. And that means you're not building up assets. You're not building up the virtuous economic cycle that should be encouraged for those who are entering the workforce. As I mentioned, we want to prioritize 2 debt-free years of community college. Many people are now using a system of doing a 2+2 at the community college and then matriculating in to higher education, to a 4-year university rather. But for those coming out, I think we need to figure out ways that we can streamline the debt that's there and the servicing on that debt to ensure that people are not effectively locked out of the ability to pursue additional loans for, say, a house or other means. But congratulations and good luck with your final semester. Kate Dykgriff, a $15 minimum wage might work in the wealthier Northern Virginia cities and counties. It seems like it would be counterproductive in the efforts to create jobs in other parts of the state, particularly Southwest Virginia. What do you think a statewide $15 minimum wage is the right, why do you think it's the right policy decision? Thank you. So for those who don't know, I have supported the Fight for 15, which is an effort to try to get the minimum wage up to $15 an hour. It's not going to happen overnight, but we have the lowest level in the country right now at $7.25 an hour. And when I think about $7.25 an hour, I don't really think of it that way. I think about $14,000 a year. $14,000 a year is approximately what you're making working full-time on minimum wage. I've been spending time with airport workers and others who are often working 2 full-time jobs over 80 hours a week and still making about $25,000 a year because some of the wages pay below minimum wage and rely on tips. I don't think that that is a system that rewards work, that treats work with dignity, and moves people, it gives people an opportunity to work their way out of poverty and into at least the working class. But it doesn't happen overnight, and there are huge regional differences. And I will work with the legislature and others to figure out how we can ensure the goal, which is for people to be at a living wage. Whatever part of the state you're in, if you're working full-time, you shouldn't be below the poverty level. We also need to be making sure we're investing in the worker training and other elements that make sure that the skills being brought into the workforce are ones that increasingly make those small businesses competitive when they are paying a living wage. I believe that the growth in our community, the economic growth, actually correlates more with the purchasing power of the working and middle class, not with, again, how the highest income earners are doing. So I think when we help everyday workers to make a little bit more money, that's money that they tend to spend in the community, often on small businesses. So I do think that there are differences between how those wages may increase in the Southwest versus the northern part of the state. But we should have the goal of saying people who are working full-time shouldn't be struggling to make ends meet below the poverty level. Dan M. Ford. All right, you spent time in Africa under the Obama administration. How would this time as a diplomat in Africa, which is a very rare experience for gubernatorial candidates, help you as governor? Essentially, what did you learn during your time in Africa that it would help you in the governor's mansion? Thanks. So I was really honored to get to represent the country and the Obama administration as a senior envoy to the African Great Lakes region. I'd previously lived in West Africa for a couple of years and done several civilian stints in Afghanistan looking at the conflict situation and how we might move through it. And I think one of the things I've learned from all of this is that people aren't that different wherever you come from. People want their families to be safe. They want their kids to have a chance at a good education and a good job. And people would really like to get along. But often the barrier is a stalemate between political elites who are benefiting from the status quo. What I've tried to learn from these experiences, both as a diplomat and a congressman, is that you want to focus on listening. I often assume everywhere that I go, including here in Virginia, that people know more about their lives and how to improve them than I do. What I can do is listen to those thoughts and use the platform that I have and the levers of power that I could have as governor to make those lives a little bit better. My feeling has been too often, whether it's in kleptocratic countries in Africa or too often in our own corrupt system, that the only voices being heard are the people who can write the biggest checks. And that's how we end up in a situation like we have here, where Virginia's falling behind on clean energy, falling behind on wages, falling behind on investments in education and infrastructure, instead of listening to the people who want to find pragmatic solutions to these efforts. So I've learned a lot from all the countries I've been in. This is always home, and it's been great to be here for this. I did another job for the State Department as well, called the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, which was looking at a strategic overhaul of 80,000 employees and a $50 billion budget. And I do think it's important for someone who's going for the governorship, to have had experience looking at that level of modern management of huge teams and huge budgets. And I think that's also something we'll try to bring into the experience as governor. Bill Shelton, sir, where do you stand on ending the drug war in Virginia, legalizing marijuana, and ending police violence against citizens? I believe that the approach we have taken in the drug war has not been a successful one, of focusing primarily on the over-criminalization and going with tougher and tougher sentencing. I think that there is room for us to be considering at least the medical use of marijuana that has been proven successful in many states, and looking at some level of decriminalization. We also need to see and understand addiction primarily as a public health problem and a crisis that needs to be dealt with. One of the things that we've heard often from law enforcement on both the issues of drug addiction and mental health is that they're being asked to play the role of counselor and of medic. And that's not really the job that we should be asking law enforcement to do, but that's because we've been investing in issues of treatment and alternate sentencing. I do believe that there's an emerging consensus across party lines that a new approach is needed. In many of the areas hit hard by the opioid crisis, we've seen alternate drug courts come up that have focused more on treatment over imprisonment. And I think that the data suggests that that's been a better approach. We want to continue to be driven by the evidence there. In Virginia, we actually have had some very successful programs with community policing. And I think what we want to do when it comes to law enforcement is focus on building on successes as well as calling out abuses where they've taken place. I think where we can invest more in our law enforcement than in the militarization of our law enforcement, focus on the personnel, then I think we get better results for everybody involved. I'm supposed to remind again that if you have a question, be sure to post it in the comments below. I will keep rocking through these. All right, Bert Green. How do you see Virginia being a leader in sustainability and clean energy? Thanks, Bert. We've talked about this for a while. First, don't go in the wrong direction. Spending $6.7 billion on 2 gas pipelines that are not needed and that take us in the wrong direction is not where Virginia should be headed. I believe we can be a leader on offshore wind. I believe we can be investing in the weatherization of both our housing stock and our building stock. We can be putting construction crews to work. We can be helping local stores that sell the insulation and other products that do it. We did some of this in Southside Virginia while I was in Congress, where we worked with dairy farmers on the methane capture coming off of cow manure and helped turn it into clean energy on the farms that helped them turn their negative energy bill actually into a positive. But we have real barriers, and too many of them come from the legislature and from the utilities. We should be able to sell power back to the grid. We should be encouraging people who do make the investments in solar power that they would get the benefits of any excess power that they are producing and selling back to the grid. But we have one of the hardest states in the country to do so. There's an incredible company here called O-Power that's based in Virginia but doesn't actually operate with the utilities in Virginia because the rules are so restrictive on investing in clean energy and energy efficiency. We're going to change that, and the first step is that I'm taking no money from Dominion Power, that is the leading contributor to both political parties. Someone asked earlier what I learned from negotiating over in Africa. One is always negotiate from strength. And when you sit down to negotiate with a utility that's paid your campaign checks, you're not in a position of strength to negotiate. They know it, and everyone in the legislature knows it. Colton Powell, what would you say to someone who supports Ralph but is open to switching sides to support you? Thank you, Colton. For those who don't know, I am in a Democratic primary. The primary date is June 13th, and we really hope that everybody shows up and votes. One of the problems I think we've had in the Democratic Party is that often very few people have been involved in choosing who their nominee is, either because that decision has been made from the top down behind closed doors or because we have a primary but so few people show up. I think the party is stronger and in a stronger position to win in November if we have a huge number of Democrats and progressives come into this process and decide who the Democratic nominee should be going forward. We believe it should be us. We think this is a time where we need a fighter who's willing to stand up to the Trump administration on the kind of hateful attacks that we've seen on our vulnerable neighbors, and I believe we've led the way on that in trying to be a firewall against Trump. But we also need a positive vision of inclusive economic growth. We need to have a vision that says it is important to be raising wages and to seeing the median family income in Virginia rise. We need to be willing to stand up to the utilities and some of the new monopolies that are crushing the ability of small business to have a shot. We need to think seriously about being able to decentralize energy and food production so that some of our counties that have been left behind have a chance. We need to look at how offering 2 years of debt-free community college is important on several of these policy issues. It's been great to see that Ralph has come around to agreeing with these positions, but I think what we're looking for right now is a leader who wants to set a bold agenda for Virginia. What I'm finding when I go around to communities all over the state is that there is a really broad consensus that President Trump's taking us in the wrong direction. But not everybody is sold on the Democratic Party. I think this is an opportunity for us to define the future, the next generation of the Democratic Party, one that's bold about economic inclusion and opportunity and the dignity of our entire coalition and every Virginian. I believe we've set that tone since January. I think that's why the momentum is on our side. The other thing that's important is that I know Democrats want to win. If we lose the State House in November, we could see the entire regressive agenda of the North Carolina legislature come through in a single cycle. It's important to have that governor in a position to veto attacks on women's reproductive health rights and other attacks on bathroom bills and other issues that have come up. I believe I put us in the best chance to win in November because I've already shown that I can win in the reddest parts of the state, that I can outperform the Democratic brand, even in tough years for Democrats. And I've done that not by selling out our principles, but by standing up and fighting for them. So I believe that this year is a year we cannot just turn out the Obama coalition that is now a solidly anti-Trump coalition, but we can also go out and reach some of those Trump voters that I've represented in the past and say, hey, the system has been rigged against you, and I'm going to stand up and fight those special interests just like I did in Congress by fighting for them here in Virginia. Thanks. All right, Justin Ihara. What are your thoughts on addressing the disparity between poorer performing schools in poorer areas and better performing schools in wealthier areas, which has caused a big achievement gap? We do have great inequalities in our educational system. Sometimes we have them even within a single school jurisdiction. One of the problems we have is that I've talked to our teachers and principals about. If you look at the data for school performance, often the greatest correlation is poverty. And I think one of the best ways that we can try to help underperforming schools is to actually take seriously the idea of eradicating poverty in our communities. It is the greatest correlation between that and underperformance, and that means that we're selling out those kids who start out in communities of concentrated poverty and isolation. We've seen a 60% increase in the number of Virginia schools that meet those standards, and that's an unfortunate reality for too many kids across Virginia. I believe by ensuring that we pay a living wage, by creating greater opportunities for people to move into the kind of career and technical training programs where they can make a living wage, are opportunities to help in these communities before those kids come into the classroom. In the classroom, we have to make sure that we're paying the kind of salaries to teachers that we can recruit and retain quality teachers and diverse teachers in many of these schools. So we think it's important. Even within some of our richest counties, we have great inequalities. So I think we need to make sure that we're looking at the special needs of each community and making sure that we're investing in each of those kids to live up to their potential. All right, Mel Parker, do you believe our gun laws should be made more responsible? If so, please explain how and how you're willing to take this on. I do believe it is important for us to pursue common sense gun reform here in Virginia. I was a major fighter for the Manchin-Toomey bill after the Sandy Hook tragedy that would have pushed for a universal background check, closing of the gun show loophole, and support for smart gun technology. I also think that looking at limiting of high magazine cartridges and certain weapon types is going to be crucial as we go forward. It's going to be a tough battle with the legislature that we have here, but I believe we can try to bring people together around common sense gun reform. I do support a Second Amendment right to bear arms, and I believe that's entirely consistent with the kind of common sense gun reform that we could pursue here in Virginia that would make our communities more safe. All right, lost the screen here. Are you in favor of supporting Planned Parenthood, and are you pro-choice? I don't like to see Planned Parenthood discredited when it provides so many general health services. I do support Planned Parenthood funding, and I am pro-choice. Planned Parenthood does provide many, many services beyond abortion and reproductive health services, but they are also a crucial provider of those services as well. When I was in Congress, I voted to protect funding for Planned Parenthood and would continue Governor McAuliffe's lead on vetoing any efforts by the legislature to defund Planned Parenthood funding. We will also continue to fight for women's right to choose and meaningful access to that right, as I talked about earlier in the Facebook Live. So thank you for raising that. Phil Cogdis, do you think there's anything you can do to fight the rising tide of white supremacy? It's a tough question, and it's an important one. I think the first thing we have to do is admit that we saw, I believe, witnessed the most viciously racist campaign of my lifetime. I think Donald Trump knew exactly what he was doing in playing to white supremacist and white nationalist tendencies, and I think many of those around him are very comfortable doing so and doing so overtly. But I think we also have to remember and take some comfort in the fact that that ideology of hate actually performed worse in Virginia than we've seen from any presidential candidate in my lifetime. So we want to call out hate where we see it. We want to stand with and protect vulnerable communities, but we also want to be clear that those are not Virginia values. I will not cede Virginia values to anyone who plays on that kind of race and hate. Through my lifetime and through our whole history, we've always had two forces in Virginia. We've had one of great aspirations of liberty and justice and equality. We are the birthplace of American democracy, of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the place where Barbara Johns walked out of the schools to demand integration, and where Doug Wilder became the first elected African-American governor in the entire country. But we've also been the birthplace of American slavery, a place of vicious Jim Crow legislation, of redlining, a place where we saw President Wilson fire African-Americans from most of the professions in the federal workforce that had become the ticket into the middle class. So we need to be honest about our history and honest about those forces in Virginia that rise up to divide us. So I think we call it out where it is, we address it. I do think that there are opportunities to engage directly with communities across the state. One thing that's very important to me is not to assume that just because Trump ran a racist campaign, that means that Trump supporters are racist. It's important to sit down and listen to our neighbors and listen to the many complex motivations of why someone may have wanted to tell the establishment that they aren't happy with the direction the two parties were going. And I think when we do show up and we have a better answer for the direction of the Commonwealth than blaming those who may not look like us, then we not only win as a party, but we bring people together as a community. All right. Chris. I don't know if your name is Chris, kind of a cool name. How will you work with the House and Senate if they are still controlled by the Republicans? They would oppose most of your agenda, but where do you think you could find compromise? First of all, I think it's going to be very important this year for us to win back a bunch of the House of Delegates seats that are available. There are about 17 seats that Hillary Clinton won those districts, but are currently held by Republican delegates. I think we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to run the tables with strong, dynamic candidates who've entered races, who've never entered politics before. If we can engage the indivisibles and the Huddles and the Emerges and others who are coming into politics either for the first time or with a renewed spirit in the era of Trump. I don't assume that the legislature I'll be working with is going to look like the one we've had in the past, because I think Virginians who so often have not shown up for state elections are going to show up in droves this year. But I also plan, as I said before, to go and win a lot of votes in some of the redder parts of the state. I believe that our message of standing up to a corrupt system that has promoted too much inequality and left too many communities behind by opposing pipelines that are deeply unpopular in red parts of the state and refusing to take money from utilities and other corporate powers that have had too much control over our system, that we're going to win back many of those voters who felt disillusioned with the Democratic Party. So we want to come in with a mandate to really focus on genuine economic opportunity and fairness for all Virginians, regardless of which zip code that you're in. And I think in doing so, we can come in with a mandate to produce real results on some of the areas that are desperately needed here in Virginia, including better investments in education and in infrastructure. So that's what we plan to do. Once we get there, if we fall short of those seats, I think there is a proud tradition in Virginia of working across the aisle to find pragmatic solutions. I think that can mean sitting down with our strong progressive principles and understanding the need to work with the other side. There's a great opportunity for us to put Virginians back to work building and making and growing things again, and we know the barriers to that involve education and infrastructure. And if we can overcome not just our partisan divisions, but our regional divisions, we can do that. As was mentioned earlier, I've been working as a peace negotiator overseas, and if I can try to bring sides together that have been at war for a long time in Central Africa, I think we can find a way to bring Republicans and Democrats together in Richmond to solve some problems. All right. Hope McDonald, will you work to make community college tuition free or lower tuition to entice those in higher unemployment areas where manufacturing jobs left to consider going to learn a trade or get a 2-year degree in lieu of tax reform for corporations? That is a great policy idea. I fully support it. We do believe in 2 years of debt-free community college and apprenticeship programs. We do believe that there are opportunities not only to see this as paying for itself by moving people into living wage tax-paying jobs and off of public assistance, but also by looking at the fact that 2/3 of corporations in Virginia pay no taxes at all. We really do believe there's an opportunity here. Just looking at apprenticeship programs for a moment, many of them run by our trade unions. There are opportunities where you're actually making money with on-the-job training rather than going into debt with a community college certificate. In these cases, many people are coming out of the apprenticeship programs making more money and with no debt compared to their colleagues that went to college who may be in a ton of debt and still waiting to find that job. So I think we can encourage and elevate this. In many ways, it's a pathway not just into the middle class, but to owning your own business and becoming a leader in the community. So we think this is a great opportunity for folks to do that. But we also need some things for those tradesmen and construction folks to do. And that means we have to break the deadlock on investing in the kind of clean energy jobs and infrastructure jobs we need to keep Virginia competitive. This question comes to us from Twitter, where you can also reach me and share your ideas. I'm at Tom Perriello. I assume that's where they're going. At Daniel Z. Werner. In the age of automation, how can we build an effective and efficient safety net for those who lose jobs? This is unfortunately a question after my own heart. We have been talking a lot about automation on the trail, and that's because it is an extremely serious challenge in our economy. Up to 47% of jobs in Virginia could be disrupted, which is a nice way of saying ended, by automation in some form over the years ahead, particularly if we see artificial intelligence and deep learning come to scale. What we see now, I think, is something that is very similar to the globalization debate a generation ago, where people understood there were huge upsides of globalization but underestimated the pain and the costs to many workers and many communities. Automation is going to hit a much broader swath of the economy because it will affect not just working class jobs, but many middle class jobs currently being done by people with college degrees. Now, automation is also very exciting in the sense that it's making our lives better, it's improving health delivery, it's improving worker safety on the job. So we can't get stuck in a false debate about whether to be for or against automation, but we must be aware as policymakers that these disruptions are coming. And as you mentioned, one of the impacts of that is going to be that people are rotating from jobs or getting kicked out of jobs or fired more often. I think that's why we're going to need an even stronger healthcare exchange at the state level. So no matter what people's employment status, they're always going to have a place to go to buy affordable health insurance on that kind of an exchange. We're going to need the kind of worker training that moves us in the right direction of moving people into those jobs. But we're also going to have to address consolidation, which is arguably the even bigger threat in the economy than automation. In the recovery of the 1990s under President Clinton, about 70% of new businesses were created in small and medium-sized towns. Under the Obama recovery, it was only about 17%. So we see a geographical consolidation. But also, since President Reagan changed our antitrust policy in the 80s, we have seen a remonopolization of almost every major economic sector that we have. It may sound old-fashioned, but we are actually going to have to get back to decentralizing certain sectors, including energy production, food production, beverage production, and other forms of artisanal production, where Virginia can be an absolute leader. I think this is a really exciting opportunity for us, but we're going to have to be very proactive about it. We've already seen a very small version of this in the microbrew and artisanal brewery area. The beer market, and Governor McAuliffe has had great leadership on this as well. Over 90% of the market used to be controlled by 2 beer companies. Now that's down to, I think, 86%. And anyone who's traveled around Virginia has seen the explosion of small businesses, and in many cases turning counties that were struggling economically into destinations. I think we can do this with distilleries and vineyards. We can do this with tourism. In some of the parts of Southwest, we can look at everything from folk music and quilting and bluegrass. We can look at artisanal furniture production. We have to take seriously in an era of automation and consolidation, focusing on those things that aren't going to be able to be done or done with the same quality through automation, and ensure that those are professions and career opportunities that are grown out with the right incentives. This also comes down to how we promote economic development in the state. It's really valuable when we can land a big corporation, but often the cost per job of those relocations is closer to $60,000 per job, whereas helping a small business expand can be as low as $1,500 to $2,000 per job created. We want to make sure we continue to believe that small businesses are the engine of our economy, and that's going to be even more challenging if we see automation and consolidation continue to be the 2 pincers that are crushing the kind of inclusive economic growth that we need. All right. Ben Capozzi, a fellow paisan, I think. What can be done to help small farmers? I am deeply troubled by a one-size-fits-all approach to agriculture, especially when that size is usually monstrously industrial. Small farmers are being denied access to the market, often their neighbors, due to excessive regulation. Well, Ben, that was extremely well timed after my last answer, so I don't know if you came in on that just now. I am a big believer, as I said, in decentralized energy production and food production, and I think our farmers are a crucial part of that. I think it's something where we have seen with Big Ag essentially a monopolization of the food sector, and then with our utilities, the energy sector. What we were able to begin doing in Southside Virginia during my time in Congress was actually work with say, dairy farmers who are on very thin margins, look at methane capture off of the cow manure, use that to sell power back to the grid, and then you go from 1 crop and 1 expense to 2 crops. And that can make our smaller and medium-sized farmers much more competitive. The same thing I think we can see with expansion of some of the higher yield markets where investments in greenhouses and other structures would allow more production on the local vegetable front and other issues. We talked earlier about the possibility of legalizing medicinal marijuana, which also could be something where we focus on small farmer production in those areas. So it can't be a situation where only the biggest ag companies can afford to follow the regulations and make it into those markets. I think there's great opportunity to expand with our smaller and medium-sized farmers. Jody Wright, Virginia has so many natural resources, all of which are in danger under the current administration. How will you protect our environment, our resources, and our wildlife? Thanks, Jody. As someone who grew up in Charlottesville and Albemarle County and was an Eagle Scout who spent a lot of time in the Shenandoah Valley, I can tell you that this state is just an absolute treasure, and we see so much of it under threat. In the Tidewater area, we're already starting to see flooding in communities across Newport News. That's something that will affect the resilience of our naval bases, but also some of the poorest communities along the water. In our mountains, as I've said, some of our most precious areas, the utilities now want to take these gas pipelines through that they haven't even shown are necessary. We are going to see, I think, serious rollbacks from the EPA at the federal level. I've been saying that I think Pruitt is probably the second scariest nominee after Jeff Sessions, though that's a pretty long list to be talking through at this point. So we are going to have to step up at the state level. Some of that's going to be where we have legal actions for reviews, like under the Clean Water Act, as well as making sure we're protecting our wilderness. Again, I think this is a place where we can get beyond the partisan divides. A lot of the parts of the state that I represented may be deep red in their politics, but they are deep green when it comes to protecting our wilderness, our areas to hunt and fish, and celebrating our environment. So I think there's great potential there. Deanna J. Tom! Exclamation point. How will you support transitioning Virginia to 100% renewable energy and limit Dominion Power's obstruction in Richmond that is keeping us hooked on fossil fuels? It is good to see the environmental community out in force on Twitter and Facebook today with the questions. As I've talked about before, I've refused to take any donations from Dominion Power or any other publicly regulated monopolies in the state and utilities in the state. We are going to move away from these kinds of wasteful programs of the past that damage our environment and risk our beautiful bay. And we are going to move towards getting at least out of the basement of being 48th out of 50th on renewable and clean energy. We're going to make that a huge priority as governor. Lonnie Murray. I don't know if that's the Lonnie Murray I went to elementary school with, but if it is, hello, Lonnie. What would you do to support ongoing efforts to clean up the Chesapeake Bay in the face of significant cuts to the EPA? First, I think it's going to be incredibly important for all of us to come together across party lines to try to prevent these proposed cuts from the Trump administration that would be a disaster for Virginia's bay. Protecting our bay should be a bipartisan issue, and seeing these kinds of dramatic cuts from the federal government would be terrible. The same thing we're seeing with the cuts to the state and U.S. aid budget as well. Some people have focused on how President Trump's budget may increase some defense spending, and there may be room for that. But if it's in conjunction with massive cuts to our diplomacy and development budgets that also employ an enormous number of Virginians and perform work that's crucial to our national security overseas, we would be potentially cutting off our nose to spite our face. So whether it's our Chesapeake Bay or all of the elements of our national security apparatus that so proudly tend to be based here in Virginia, I think it's important that we take a broad approach of investing in the Virginia economy and beyond. All right, I'm being told that I'm supposed to wrap up. Last question. Michael Goldenpine. How do you convince voters who only show up for presidential elections that their concerns can best be addressed by getting engaged in state politics? It's a great question, Michael. We really do have a problem in Virginia and really across the country that so many people get focused on the presidential elections and then don't show up in state elections. But on so many of the issues that we care deeply about, states are actually in a leadership position. When it comes to attacks on women's health and women's rights, it's been the states where we've seen the most draconian and disastrous laws proposed, and it's going to be vital for me to be in a position to veto those efforts. On issues like wages and the minimum wage, states have a wonderful opportunity to try to move us towards a living wage. On the issue of community policing and criminal justice reform, where we can go from a school-to-prison pipeline to a school-to-workforce pipeline, again, it's going to be states and localities that are in the lead. In the same way, we've seen some communities across Virginia be leaders on community policing and best practices. On the issue of protecting the environment, unfortunately, for the next 4 years, we are going to need the states to step up in order to be the great promoters of clean energy and sustainability. On so many issues, college affordability, whether we're investing in our public education system and our public universities, whether we're helping to create space for small business to grow. So I think state politics matter. They matter this year more than ever. And in this case, the Virginia state election is also probably national in its significance. 8 years ago, it was the Republican victory in Virginia in the first year of President Obama's administration that began the momentum for the Tea Party to move towards its big victories in 2010. And it also slowed down the gears of what President Obama was able to accomplish. We believe right now in Virginia, this is an opportunity to do the same thing in reverse, to be a very clear sign to Republicans in Congress and elsewhere that standing with the Trump administration on these extreme policies are going to be bad politics for them at election time. But we also want to show to Democrats that this is a time not to sell out or water down our values, but to stand up and be proud of the progressive values of justice and dignity for all, of giving everyone a fair shot, of taking on a system of corruption and inequality that has left too many Virginians behind. So I think it's a huge opportunity. That's why we're hoping so many of you will join us and become volunteers on the campaign. We'll come out on June 13th to vote for us in the primary, and perhaps even have a little fun doing so. And what I mean by that is that we are going to have a party on March 24th, a rockin' rally. We had one in Charlottesville that was a huge hit. Over 600 people came out for a day of blues and bluegrass. Well, this time, the rally is going to be headlined by the Sierra Leone All-Stars, Nag Champa, and the Perriello Pickers. The Sierra Leone Refugee All-Stars was a band actually formed in a refugee camp in West Africa where I had been working on the peace process. And they've agreed to come out and do a charity concert that's also a chance for us to shine a light on how much refugee populations bring a value to our communities here across Virginia. So it's going to be a night of great music. You can go to my Facebook page or tomforvirginia.com to get tickets. And it's March 24th, State Theater, Falls Church, lots of good music, and a chance to get more involved in our campaign. So thank you so much for tuning in today on our Snow Day Town Hall. Thank you so much for those who've helped us gather petitions around the state to get on the ballot. Thank you for hosting the house parties and coming out to our town hall meetings. I've been really, really touched by the ideas. Keep them coming on Facebook, on Twitter, and everywhere else. Thank you so much, and good luck.